The single grape sat on the polished oak of the council table, a small, dark jewel under the flat, judgmental light of the oil lamps. It was perfect, plump, taut-skinned, and dusted with a faint, silvery bloom that spoke of impossible health. Outside, a late autumn chill was already sharpening its teeth on the edges of the town of Prospect Creek, a promise of the brutal winter to come. Marcus had placed the grape there as evidence, a tangible piece of a dream they could not comprehend. He stood alone before the 4 men who ran the town, his hands stained with the dirt of his labor, his face weathered not just by the sun but by a grief that had settled deep into his bones. Sheriff Croft, a man whose authority was as rigid as the star pinned to his chest, picked up the grape between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the light as if it were a counterfeit coin. He did not see a miracle of cultivation, he saw an aberration, a symptom of a mind unsettled by loss. "So you're telling us," the sheriff began, his voice laced with a weary condescension that was far crueler than outright anger, "that you dug a hole. A giant hole. And in this hole, you believe you can grow fruit through a Wyoming winter." Marcus's jaw was tight. "I don't believe it. I am doing it. This is the proof." He gestured to the grape. The other men, a merchant, a banker, and a landowner, shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of pity and impatience. They had all known his wife, Clara, and her passing a year prior had been a blow to the small community. But their sympathy had curdled into suspicion as Marcus withdrew, selling off most of his herd and dedicating himself to a project that seemed like pure, undiluted madness. He was digging his own grave, they whispered in the general store, only he was doing it while he was still breathing. The sheriff rolled the grape in his palm, then casually tossed it into a nearby waste bin. The soft thud was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. "We need every able-bodied man focused on practical matters, Marcus. Reinforcing fences, stocking lumber, securing the communal stores. We face a hard winter. The almanac predicts a bad one, and the animals are already heading for low ground. We can't afford this distraction." He said the word distraction as if it were a disease. "What you do on your own land is your business, but don't bring your delusions here. Don't waste our time with it." The dismissal was absolute. There was no room for debate, no curiosity, only the cold, hard wall of their certainty. Marcus looked at their faces, seeing not leaders, but men afraid of anything they didn't already understand. He gave a single, sharp nod, turned without another word, and walked out of the council room, the slam of the door echoing behind him. He didn't just leave the room, he was cast out from the circle of their shared reality. They had drawn a line, and he was now on the other side of it, alone with his madness and the coming cold. The idea had not been born of madness, but of memory. It had taken root in the quiet, hollowed-out days after he had buried Clara on the small rise overlooking the ranch. Her absence was a physical presence, a cold spot in their bed, a silence where her laughter used to be. He would walk the land they had worked together, his boots tracing paths worn by their shared hopes, and find himself stopping at the small, struggling patch of mission vines they had planted near the south-facing wall of the house. They had been her project, an attempt to bring a small piece of her Californian childhood to the harsh high plains. Most years, the vines barely survived, their leaves scorched by the relentless summer sun and their tender shoots killed by a single, unexpected late spring frost. Yet, she had loved them. "The sun gives life, but it also takes it," she had told him once, shielding a cluster of tiny, green grapes with her hand. "If only we could have just the right amount. Just the warmth, without the burn." That sentence replayed in his mind in the lonely months that followed. The warmth, without the burn. The light, without the frost. He found himself staring at the root cellar, a simple dugout carved into the hillside where they stored potatoes and preserves. It was cool in the summer, and it never froze in the winter. The earth itself was the great insulator, the patient moderator of extremes. An idea, fragile at first, began to form. It was a foolish, audacious thought, the kind a man only has when he has nothing left to lose. What if he didn't just build a cellar for roots, but a sanctuary for living things? What if he went down, deep into the earth, to escape the tyranny of the sky? He would dig a vineyard, a subterranean world where he controlled the climate, where the gentle, constant temperature of the deep soil would protect the vines from both the searing heat and the killing frost. He would build it for her, a monument of dirt and stone and life, a place where her impossible dream could finally flourish. The town saw a man digging a hole, he saw a man building a promise. He sold off his cattle, keeping only a single mule for heavy work and a few chickens for eggs. The money went not to drink, as the gossips presumed, but to panes of glass, to heavy timbers for support, to tools that would not break against the stubborn, rocky soil. He worked from sun-up to sundown, driven by a purpose that was invisible to everyone but him. His grief was no longer a weight that held him down, it was the fuel for his shovel, the grit in his hands, the relentless rhythm of his heart. Every scoop of earth was a word in a long conversation with her memory. They called it madness, but for Marcus, it was the only sane thing left to do in a world that had been stripped of its meaning. He wasn't burying himself. He was planting a new reason to live. The work was a brutal testament to the power of a single, focused will. His ranch was miles from town, set in a shallow basin that offered some protection from the wind but was notorious for collecting cold. He chose his spot on a gentle, south-facing slope, pacing out a massive rectangle, 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. This was not a cellar, it was a cathedral of earth he was planning. The first cut into the prairie sod was the hardest. The grass was a thick, tangled mat, its roots woven together over centuries. He used a sharpened spade, his body weight driving it into the ground, feeling the satisfying tear as he peeled back the living skin of the earth. Beneath it lay the topsoil, rich and dark, which he carefully moved to a separate pile. He knew he would need it later. Then came the clay and rock. Day after day, the pit deepened, his progress measured in inches. The rhythmic scrape of the shovel, the thud of the pickaxe, the groan of the wheelbarrow, these were the only sounds for miles, save for the caw of a passing raven or the sigh of the wind. His body, already hardened by years of ranching, was reforged in the pit. His hands became calloused, then split, then healed into thick, leathery pads. His shoulders and back ached with a fire that never fully went out, a constant reminder of the sheer tonnage of the planet he was attempting to move. He had his old mule, patient and grey, to help haul the larger rocks away on a stone boat, a simple wooden sled that scraped over the dry ground. Man and animal worked in a silent, practiced rhythm, a partnership born of shared toil. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain, a monument to his obsession that was visible from the distant track that led to town. Riders would sometimes pause on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, staring down at the lone figure in the massive hole. They would watch for a few minutes, shake their heads, and ride on, carrying the tale of Marcus's folly back with them. He was aware of their judgment, but he had no energy to spare for it. All his focus, all his strength, was directed downward. He was not just digging, he was sculpting. He engineered a slight, uniform slope to the floor of the pit for drainage. He learned the language of the subterranean layers, the soft, yielding clay, the frustrating bands of shale that shattered into sharp flakes, the stubborn, granite boulders that had to be broken apart with sledge and wedge or painstakingly dug around. He was in a constant battle with gravity, with geology, with the sheer, dumb inertia of the world. And slowly, impossibly, he was winning. The pit grew deeper, 10 feet, then 12, then 15. He was creating a space out of nothing, an absence that would soon be filled with life. Down in the cool, damp air of the hole, the world above seemed distant, its judgments irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the next swing of the pickaxe, the next shovelful of dirt, the slow, steady progress toward the vision only he could see. As the great trench reached its final depth of 15 feet, the nature of the work shifted from brute excavation to careful construction. The earthen walls, while mostly stable, were a constant threat. A collapse would be a tomb. He began lining the entire structure with stone. For weeks, he and his mule hauled load after load of flat, weathered rock from the dry creek bed a half-mile away. It was another slow, back-breaking process, fitting the stones together like a vast, irregular puzzle. He used no mortar in the main walls, instead relying on the ancient technique of dry stacking, carefully selecting and placing each rock so that its weight and shape locked it into place against its neighbors. This allowed for minuscule shifts as the ground settled and, more importantly, allowed the earth's moisture to seep through, maintaining the humidity the vines would need. It was a skill he hadn't known he possessed, a patience learned from watching the slow, deliberate pace of nature itself. He was not conquering the earth, he was negotiating with it. For the roof, he laid heavy timbers across the 30-foot span, sourced from a stand of lodgepole pine miles up in the hills, a purchase that had eaten most of his remaining funds. On top of these, he layered thick planks, followed by a layer of tar paper for waterproofing, and then, finally, he returned the tons of soil he had so carefully excavated, burying his creation until it once again became part of the hillside. Only one feature betrayed its existence: the entrance. This was his masterpiece of practical engineering. Instead of a simple door, he built a long, sloping entryway, a glass-roofed corridor that descended into the earth. It faced due south, designed to capture every possible hour of the low winter sun, acting as a passive solar collector that would draw warmth down into the main chamber. The precious glass panes were framed in sturdy wood and sealed with pitch. A heavy, insulated door stood at the bottom of the ramp, a barrier between his subterranean haven and the world outside. When it was finished, he stood inside for the first time, the door sealed, and was enveloped in a profound silence. The air was cool, damp, and smelled of stone and rich soil. A dim, ethereal light filtered down through the glazed entryway, illuminating the cavernous space. It was a place apart, a secret kingdom beneath the prairie. He then brought in the topsoil he had saved, spreading it a foot deep across the stone floor. He had spent the last year nurturing the cuttings from Clara's hardiest vines, keeping them alive in pots in his small cabin. Now, with the reverence of a priest, he planted them. He set them in neat rows, their roots settling into the dark, welcoming soil. He watered them from the small cistern he had built to collect runoff, his hands gentle on the fragile stems. He had done it. The folly was complete. It was a dark, silent, waiting space. A tomb to some, but to Marcus, it was a womb, pregnant with a defiant promise of life. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. A snap frost in early October, sharp and sudden as a striking snake, descended upon the valley. In the morning, the fields in and around Prospect Creek were white with rime, the last of the garden crops blackened and limp on their stalks. A collective groan went through the town. It was a bad omen, a confirmation of the almanac's dire predictions. People began to talk more urgently about the winter, their voices tight with an anxiety that now had a crisp, frozen edge. Miles away, Marcus walked down the sunlit ramp of his vineyard and opened the heavy door. Inside, the air was a steady 55 degrees. The delicate green leaves of his young vines were untouched, glistening with health in the dim light. He had won the first battle. As autumn deepened, the world above ground began to shut down, the trees shedding their leaves, the grasses turning a brittle brown. But in his subterranean world, it was a perpetual, gentle spring. The vines, protected from the harsh extremes, grew with a vigor he had only dreamed of. They climbed the trellises he had built, their tendrils reaching out as if in gratitude. He spent his days down there, pruning, watering, tending to his charges with a singular devotion. The work was his solace, the green growth his reward. That fall, he had his first true harvest. It was not large, just a few baskets of small, intensely flavored grapes from the most mature vines. He carried them up into his cabin, the dark clusters looking like amethysts against the pale wood of the basket. He crushed them himself, using a small press he had built, the sweet, purple juice staining his hands. He fermented the must in a small cask, watching it bubble and transform. It was a quiet, personal ritual, a communion with his memory of Clara and the culmination of his impossible project. He bottled the wine, a few dozen bottles of a dark, rich red. He didn't take it to town. He didn't try to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had already tried and been dismissed. This was for him. One evening, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a sky the color of lead, he opened a bottle. He poured a glass for himself and a second, which he placed on the empty chair at his table. He raised his glass. "For you, Clara," he whispered to the silence. The warmth, without the burn of the wine, was good, better than he had hoped. It tasted of the earth, of patience, and of a love that had refused to die. Outside, the snow was beginning to stick, a soft, white blanket that would soon become a shroud. He felt no fear, only a quiet sense of readiness. Let it come. The storm that arrived was not a storm, it was a siege. It began not with a fury but with a quiet, relentless persistence, the snow falling thick and straight in the windless air. For 2 days, it accumulated, a soft, silent burial. It climbed the walls of his cabin, sealed the windows into opaque white squares, and rose against the doors. Then the wind came. It howled down from the north, a physical force that scoured the landscape, picking up the fallen snow and turning the world into a churning, white chaos. The temperature plummeted to depths that froze the mercury in the thermometer. It was a blizzard of historic proportions, the kind old-timers spoke of with a shudder, a white death that erased landmarks and swallowed whole ranches. In Prospect Creek, the town was paralyzed. No one could leave their homes. The streets vanished. The world shrank to the space within 4 walls, the only sound the shriek of the wind and the groaning of timbers under the weight of the snow. The communal stores were secure, but they were finite. Fear, once a low hum of anxiety, became a palpable presence in every household, cold and suffocating as the drifts piling up outside. For Marcus, the blizzard was an external event, a drama playing out on the other side of a wall. His cabin was nearly buried, but he had laid in enough firewood and supplies to last for months. His days took on a monastic rhythm. In the morning, he would make his way through a short, timber-reinforced tunnel he had dug between his cabin and the vineyard's entrance. He would descend the glass-roofed ramp, the world of white fury visible above, and enter his sanctuary. Down in the vineyard, the storm did not exist. The temperature held steady. The oil lamps cast a warm, golden glow over the rows of green leaves. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of condensation or the rustle of a leaf. He worked, tending his vines, his movements unhurried. He was a keeper of a secret garden at the end of the world. He would eat his simple meals down there, sitting on a stone bench, the smell of damp earth and growing things in his nostrils. The contrast was staggering. Above, a world of death, of frozen, screaming chaos. Below, a world of life, of patient, green tranquility. He felt a strange detachment, not of callousness, but of profound separation. He had built this refuge with his own 2 hands, dug it out of the earth in defiance of their scorn. He had created his own season, his own climate. He had not done it to escape them, but to honor a memory. Yet, in doing so, he had walled himself off from their fate. As the storm raged on for a 3rd day, then a 4th, he felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but a deep, somber awareness of the chasm that now lay between him and the town of Prospect Creek. They were trapped in the winter they had prepared for. He was living in a spring of his own making. The blizzard finally broke after 7 days, leaving behind a world transformed and terrifying. The sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue, the sun gleaming on a landscape of sculpted ice and snow that was 10, 15, 20 feet deep in places. The wind had carved the drifts into fantastic shapes, beautiful and lethal. Prospect Creek was entombed. The townspeople dug themselves out, creating a network of narrow canyons between the buildings. The roads were gone. The ranches in the outlying valleys were completely cut off. For the first week, there was a sense of grim solidarity. They cleared paths, checked on neighbors, shared what they had. But as the 2nd week turned into the 3rd, a new and more insidious enemy began to make its presence felt. It started with the children, bleeding gums, a strange lethargy, bruises that appeared from the slightest touch. Then the adults, aching joints, old wounds reopening, a profound and debilitating weakness. The town doctor, a man more accustomed to setting bones and delivering babies, recognized the signs with a sinking heart. Scurvy. The scourge of sailors and isolated armies, born of a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Their winter stores were heavy on salted meat, flour, and beans, but the preserved fruits and potatoes were already running low, far lower than anyone had anticipated for such a prolonged isolation. Panic began to set in, a quiet, gnawing terror that was worse than the storm itself. They were surviving, but they were also slowly, inexorably falling apart from the inside. It was Sheriff Croft who first remembered. He was sitting at his own kitchen table, watching his wife try to coax their young daughter to eat, her pale gums bleeding slightly when she bit into a piece of hard biscuit. The image of a single, perfect grape, tossed contemptuously into a waste bin, flashed in his mind. He remembered Marcus's earnest, dirt-stained face. He remembered the collective scorn, his own condescending words. "Don't bring your delusions here." A cold dread, colder than the frost on his windowpane, settled in his gut. Madness. They had called it madness. But what if it wasn't? What if, in their arrogant certainty, they had dismissed the one thing that could save them? The thought was so unbearable he almost pushed it away, but the sight of his daughter's pale face made it impossible to ignore. He called a meeting with the same men who had sat in judgment of Marcus months before. Their faces were gaunt now, their confidence shattered. "There's a chance," Croft said, his voice raspy. "A long shot. But we have to try." The plan was desperate. Someone would have to travel on snowshoes to Marcus's ranch. It was a perilous journey over an unrecognizable landscape, but it was their only hope. A young deputy, Finn, a quiet but resilient man who had always felt a pang of sympathy for the grieving rancher, volunteered. He was given the best snowshoes, a small pack of dried meat, and the heavy weight of the town's desperate, last-ditch hope. The journey was a nightmare. Finn, fit and young, found himself struggling against a landscape that had become alien and hostile. The snow was not a flat blanket but a treacherous terrain of hidden crevasses, steep drifts, and icy crusts that broke without warning. It took him an entire day of grueling, lung-searing effort to cover the few miles to Marcus's ranch. When he finally crested the last ridge and looked down into the basin, his heart sank. The ranch was gone. The cabin, the barn, the fences, all of it was buried under a colossal wave of white. It looked like a polar wasteland, silent and utterly devoid of life. He almost turned back, convinced that Marcus had perished along with his folly. But then, as the low afternoon sun cast long blue shadows, he saw it. A faint, rectangular patch on the slope of the hill that seemed to glow. It was a soft, internal luminescence, an impossible sight in this frozen world. He stumbled and slid his way down the slope toward the strange light. As he got closer, he realized he was looking at a pane of glass, swept mostly clear by the wind, with the sun shining through it into some hidden depth. He brushed away the remaining snow and peered down. What he saw made him gasp, the sound loud in the profound silence. Below him was a world of impossible green. Rows of living, breathing vines, heavy with clusters of dark grapes, stretched away into the dimness. It was a scene from another season, another planet. He found the entrance to the ramp, a dark slash in the snow, and half slid, half climbed down. At the bottom, he pushed on the heavy wooden door. It swung inward, and he was met with a wave of cool, humid air that smelled of earth and life. Marcus was there, standing at the far end of a row, a pair of shears in his hand. He looked up, his face unreadable, showing no surprise, as if he had been expecting a visitor all along. Finn, overwhelmed and exhausted, leaned against the stone wall for support. "Marcus," he stammered, his breath clouding in the cool air. The town, we're in troubles." Marcus finished snipping a small, imperfect leaf from a vine before he turned his full attention to the deputy. His eyes were cold, not with anger, but with a deep, settled calm that was far more intimidating. He remembered Finn as one of the few who had never openly mocked him, a silent presence on the edge of the crowd. He waited. "It's a sickness," Finn said, his voice cracking. "The doctor calls it scurvy. They're getting weak. The children first. We have no fresh food left." "Sheriff Croft," he remembered your grapes. He looked around at the impossible bounty, his expression a mixture of awe and shame. "We were wrong," Finn said, the words simple and direct. Everyone was wrong. Marcus slowly wiped the shears on his trousers and walked toward him, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast chamber. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze level. "And now you need my madness." The words hung in the cool, damp air, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. It wasn't spoken with triumph or bitterness, but with the quiet, unassailable weight of truth. Finn could only nod, his gaze fixed on the clusters of dark fruit hanging like chandeliers in the dim light. This was not just food, it was a miracle. It was hope, made tangible and real. Marcus looked at the young deputy, seeing the genuine desperation in his eyes, the chapped lips and the exhaustion etched around his mouth. He thought of Sheriff Croft and the other councilmen, of their smug, pitying faces in the lamplight. He could have said no. He could have closed the door and left them to the fate they had so arrogantly dismissed. The temptation was there, a dark, satisfying coal of resentment glowing in his chest. He could let them learn the full price of their pride. But then, his gaze drifted past Finn to the rows of living vines, the product of his grief and his love. He had not built this place for vengeance. He had built it to affirm life in the face of death. To deny that very principle now, to hoard his miracle out of spite, would be a betrayal of Clara's memory, a betrayal of the very purpose that had driven him into the earth. And he thought of the children. He had no children of his own, but he knew the sound of their laughter from town, a sound that had been absent for too long. He would not let them suffer for the foolishness of their parents. He turned and walked over to a stack of shallow, wooden baskets. He handed one to Finn. "Then let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice even. "Start picking. Gently." Only the darkest clusters for the next hour, they worked in near silence, moving down the rows. Marcus showed Finn how to support the cluster from beneath and snip the stem without bruising the fruit. The young deputy worked with irreverent care, his hands, clumsy with cold, slowly becoming more deft. The baskets filled with astonishing speed, a mountain of deep purple wealth. Marcus then led him to another corner of the cavern, where dozens of bottles of dark wine were neatly racked. "This will be even better for the sickness," Marcus explained, his tone becoming that of a teacher. "The fermentation preserves what's in the skin. It's concentrated." A small amount each day, he packed several wooden crates with the bottles, his movements efficient and sure. He was no longer the town eccentric. He was a man in his element, the master of a domain no one else had understood. As they prepared to leave, loading the precious cargo onto a sled Marcus had fashioned for moving through the deep snow, Marcus looked at Finn. "There's a condition," he said. "You will tell the sheriff that I will bring more. But the next time I come, I will not come alone. I will need help. Not to receive a handout, but to work. This place can support the whole town, but not by my hand alone. They will learn to tend it. They will learn to respect it." Finn nodded, understanding completely. This wasn't about charity. It was about a shared future, a lesson that had to be learned with sweat and humility. The return to Prospect Creek was a spectacle. Marcus, leading his mule, which pulled the heavily laden sled, with Finn at his side, appeared like a vision out of the white wilderness. As they entered the narrow snow canyons of the main street, people emerged from their homes, drawn by the sight. They were pale, slow-moving figures, wrapped in blankets against the cold. Their eyes, listless and dull with sickness, widened at the sight of the sled. At first, they saw the baskets, and a murmur went through the crowd. Then they saw what was in them. Grapes. Fresh, perfect grapes, gleaming like dark jewels in the winter sun. A child pointed, his voice a weak cry, "Look!" The effect was electric. It was as if they had forgotten what fresh food looked like. It was a promise of life, a refutation of the frozen death that surrounded them. Sheriff Croft and the other council members were waiting in the center of town. They stood in a line, their faces a mixture of shame, desperation, and awe. Croft stepped forward, his authoritative posture gone, replaced by the stoop of a humbled man. He looked at the bounty on the sled, then at Marcus's hard, quiet face. "Marcus," he began, his voice thick. There are no words. We were fools. Arrogant fools. What you have done here," he trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the grapes. Marcus did not wait for the apology to be completed. He began unloading the baskets, handing them to the women who had gathered, showing them how to crush a few grapes to make a juice for the children who were too weak to chew. He opened a crate of wine and handed a bottle to the doctor. "A small cup for every adult, twice a day," he said, his voice carrying in the silent street. It will work faster than the fruit alone. He worked with a calm authority that eclipsed the sheriff's star completely. When the fruit and wine had been distributed, and the first sips were bringing a flicker of life back to dull eyes, Marcus finally turned to face the council. He was not the supplicant they had dismissed months ago. He was their savior. "I have more," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Enough for everyone. But my price is not your gratitude. It's your labor. Tomorrow at dawn, I will need 10 able-bodied men and women. You will come to my ranch, and you will learn. You will dig. You will haul stone. We are going to make it bigger. Big enough for all of us. You called my work a folly. Now, it will be your salvation. And you will build it with your own hands." There was no argument. There was only the silent, nodding assent of a people who had been brought to the brink and saved by the very madness they had mocked. The reckoning was not one of punishment, but of shared work. It was not about forgiveness, but about a fundamental change in their relationship with the world, and with the man they had cast out.